Hello, friends. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we begin tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe, give this video a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means a lot, and it helps us bring you more late night stories to keep you company before sleep. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and let's step into tonight's story. The forgotten payphone on a street corner in New York City. But tonight, we will retell this story in a way that might feel closer to home for those listening from the United Kingdom. It was a damp evening in London, late autumn of 2019. The streets around Shoreditch were alive with the sound of Friday night. Music spilling from pubs, the distant hum of buses, and the shuffle of people in coats hurrying along the wet pavements. Amongst all the neon lights, food stalls, and painted brick walls, there was something out of place. At the corner of Old Street Half, hidden between a boarded-up shop and a mural splashed in bright graffiti, stood a relic of the past, a lonely red payphone booth. Most people passed by without so much as a glance. For them, it was just part of the scenery, another piece of London's history slowly fading away. But for Edward Clark, a 38-year-old journalist working for a small local paper, that night would become etched into memory because of that very booth. Edward had just finished an exhausting interview at a bar 2 streets away. It was about gentrification, rising rent, and the way long-time residents felt pushed out of the city they once called home. He had his notebook tucked under his arm, and his scarf pulled tight against the drizzle. As he reached the corner, he noticed the booth. Something about it felt strange. Its glass was cleaner than most abandoned ones, and inside, the payphone handset hung neatly in place, as if someone had used it not too long ago. Curiosity tugged at him. Edward slowed his pace, glanced around, and stepped closer. The street lamp above flickered, casting the booth in alternating light and shadow. He placed his hand on the cold handle, pulled the creaking door open, and for a brief second, he thought he heard a faint ringing, so soft it might have been his imagination. The smell inside was a mix of rust, dust, and old rainwater. He lifted the handset to his ear, expecting silence. Instead, there was static. Then a voice, a woman's voice, distant and fragile, as though speaking from across decades. "Is anyone there?" Edward froze. His heart beat faster, and he almost laughed at himself, thinking it must be some prank or maybe a crossed line. But the voice came again, trembling, pleading. "My name is Margaret. Please, if you can hear me, I'm at the corner of Bishopsgate and Brushfield Street. I can't get out. Please help." Edward stepped out of the booth, looking around the busy street. Bishopsgate was less than a 10-minute walk from where he stood. The drizzle was now heavier, soaking into his coat, but his mind was too restless to care. Who was Margaret? Why was she using this booth? And how could he be hearing her when the phone hadn't even asked for coins? For a moment, he considered walking away. London was full of strange things. Street performers, drunk tourists, late-night pranks. But there was something in her voice, something raw and fearful, that clung to him. Against his better judgment, he slipped the handset back into place, shut the booth door, and turned in the direction of Bishopsgate. The streets grew quieter as he walked. Pubs gave way to shuttered shops, and the music faded behind him. The air was colder here, the kind of chill that seemed to creep beneath the skin. Edward glanced at his watch. 10:47 p.m. The city was still alive, but in these corners it felt lonelier, almost forgotten. When he reached the intersection of Bishopsgate and Brushfield Street, he stopped. There was no Margaret, No sign of anyone waiting desperately for help. The street was nearly empty. Just the occasional taxi and a group of students laughing in the distance. But then Edward noticed something. At the far side of the street, by the edge of Spitalfields Market, stood another phone booth. Not the iconic red one this time, but a more modern glass version, scratched and neglected. Its interior light flickered faintly, and as Edward drew closer, he felt a strange pull, the same as he had by Old Street. He hesitated, his breath visible in the damp night air. And then, the phone inside began to ring. The phone inside began to ring. Edward froze where he stood, his shoes planted on the damp pavement. The sound was unmistakable, clear, mechanical, urgent. Each chime seemed louder than the last, cutting through the muffled city noise like a warning bell. He glanced around the street. No one else paid any attention. The taxis sped past, their headlights flashing across wet asphalt. The group of students had disappeared into the distance. It was as though the ringing was meant only for him. He swallowed hard and stepped closer. The booth stood like a glass coffin, its walls etched with scratched initials and stickers that had peeled from years of rain. The light inside flickered unevenly, casting a pale glow across the receiver that dangled as if waiting. Edward pushed the door open, the hinges protesting with a shrill squeak. The smell inside was metallic, with the faint trace of cigarettes smoked long ago. The ringing persisted, steady and insistent. He reached for the receiver, his fingers trembling slightly. The moment he touched it, the sound ceased, replaced by silence and a faint hiss of static. For several seconds, nothing happened. He almost lowered the receiver back into place, ready to dismiss the whole ordeal as some kind of trick his mind had conjured after a long day. But then the voice returned. "Hello? Please, is anyone there?" It was her again, Margaret, the same trembling tone he had heard earlier on Old Street. Edward's breath caught in his throat. I can hear you," he said cautiously. His own voice echoed oddly inside the booth, making him sound like a stranger to himself. "Who are you? What's happening?" The reply came after a sharp crackle, her words broken, like a signal struggling to break free of time itself. "I don't know where I am. It's dark. I've been trying to call for days. You have to help me. Please." Edward's pulse raced. He leaned against the booth's glass, staring out at the nearly deserted street, as if expecting someone to materialize. "Where are you exactly?" he asked. "You said Bishopsgate and Brushfield, but I'm here now. There's no one." A pause followed. He could hear her breathing, shallow, quick. Then she whispered, "I'm in the booth, but I can't get out." Edward turned sharply, glancing around as if she might be hiding in plain sight. The booth he stood in was empty except for him. There was no one else, yet her voice was so close, so real, as if she were standing only inches away. "I don't understand," he muttered. "You say you're here, but—" "Please don't hang up," Margaret interrupted. Her voice cracked, filled with desperation. "If you hang up, I'll disappear again. Just stay with me." Edward's rational mind screamed at him to stop. He was a journalist, not a ghost hunter, not a detective chasing urban legends. He had deadlines, a flat in Hackney waiting for him, a pile of laundry and unopened letters at home. Yet something about her voice made it impossible to walk away. It wasn't just fear he heard. It was loneliness, aching and raw. "I won't hang up," he promised, though his hands shook as he gripped the receiver. "But I need answers. Margaret, when is it for you? What year is it? Silence, then a faint reply. It's October, 1987. Edward nearly dropped the receiver. His mind reeled. The booth around him suddenly felt colder, the glass frosting slightly as though responding to her words. He pressed his forehead against it, trying to steady himself. "That's not possible," he whispered. Her breathing quickened. "I don't care if it's possible. All I know is I'm trapped. I see shadows outside, but they don't see me. The phone is the only thing that works. I've called and called, but no one answered until you." Edward rubbed his temples. He thought of all the strange calls he had reported on in the past. Scams, late-night hoaxes, conspiracy theorists claiming signals could cross time. He had written them off as harmless delusions. But this was different. He could hear her, clear and undeniable. "What happened to you?" he asked softly. There was a long pause. Then, in a trembling voice, she said, "I was waiting for someone. A friend. It was late, and I thought I heard footsteps. Then the door closed. The glass fogged over. I couldn't see out anymore. I've been here ever since." The drizzle outside turned into heavier rain, rattling against the booth like fingers drumming on glass. Edward felt his breath catch in the confined space. He stared at the rain-slick street, his reflection distorted on the glass pane. "Margaret," he said, choosing his words carefully, "if you're in 1987 and I'm in 2019, then somehow this phone is connecting us. I don't know how, but maybe I can find out." Her voice cracked with hope. "You believe me?" Edward closed his eyes. "I don't know what I believe, but I hear you. That's enough." For a moment, neither spoke. Only the static filled the silence, like a ghostly presence between them. Then Margaret whispered, almost too quietly to catch, "You're the first person to listen." Edward exhaled slowly. He leaned against the cold glass, rainwater streaking down outside. In his mind, questions piled up. Was Margaret real, or a fragment of some old radio transmission bleeding through the lines? Was he losing his grip after too many late nights and deadlines? Yet deep down, beneath the journalist's skepticism, something stirred. A need to know, to uncover the truth. "I'll come back," he said finally. "Tomorrow night. Same time, same place. Don't give up, Margaret." Her response was a soft, fragile sob. "Please don't leave me too long." The line went dead. Edward lowered the receiver with shaking hands. The booth light flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the rain poured harder, soaking the street in silver reflections. He stepped out, the city suddenly feeling heavier, as though carrying a secret only he now shared. As he walked away, he glanced back at the booth. It stood silent, just another forgotten relic in a city that never slept. But Edward knew it wasn't ordinary anymore. Something lingered inside those glass walls, something waiting. When he finally reached his flat that night, he couldn't sleep. The sound of Margaret's voice echoed in his mind, fragile yet insistent, calling from a place he couldn't fully comprehend. He sat at his desk, opened his notebook, and began to write. He scribbled down every word she had said, every detail, as though anchoring her existence on paper might prevent her from slipping away. By the time dawn crept through the blinds, Edward had filled several pages. He stared at the words, then at the old rotary phone that sat unused on his shelf, a decorative piece he had bought at a flea market years ago. For the first time, he wondered if it might ring. The following day, London carried on as though nothing had happened. The trains rumbled in and out of Liverpool Street Station. Taxis honked through the morning traffic, and commuters hurried along pavements with coffee cups in hand. Yet for Edward Clark, the world had shifted. He had barely slept, his mind restless with the sound of Margaret's voice. The way she had spoken, pleading, fragile, but undeniably real, echoed louder than the rain outside his window. By mid-morning, he was already sifting through old archives at the newspaper office. The building smelled of ink and dust, its walls lined with cabinets no one touched anymore, relics from the days before everything went digital. Edward logged into the archive database, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He typed the name Margaret, paired with the year 1987, and narrowed the search to the Bishopsgate area. At first, nothing appeared. Dozens of irrelevant articles flashed across the screen. Political scandals, financial news, sports highlights. Then one headline caught his eye. Missing woman. Margaret Holloway disappears near Bishopsgate. The article was dated November 2nd, 1987. Edward's chest tightened. He clicked the record, scanning the faded type. It described how Margaret Holloway, a 27-year-old secretary at a financial firm, had gone missing after leaving work one rainy evening. She was last seen by a colleague walking toward Bishopsgate, not far from Spitalfields Market. Witnesses reported she often used the payphone on the corner to call her parents before heading home. But that night, she never made it back. Her disappearance sparked a brief police search, but without leads, the case had gone cold. Edward leaned back in his chair, staring at the article. The year, the location, the name. They matched perfectly. His heart pounded as he whispered her name aloud, testing its weight in the present. Margaret Holloway. The office around him was buzzing with the noise of phones and printers. Yet Edward felt a strange silence settle over him. He had stumbled into something far beyond a simple curiosity. If the woman he had spoken to was truly Margaret, then she had been reaching across more than 30 years of silence. He printed the article and tucked it into his notebook. For the rest of the day, he tried to focus on his regular assignments, but his concentration wavered. Every ticking clock, every ringing phone, pulled his mind back to that booth. By the time night fell, he found himself walking again toward Bishopsgate. The city glistened under a steady drizzle, its streets alive with light and movement. Yet for Edward, everything felt muted, as though the night itself were holding its breath. The booth waited for him on the corner, its pale light flickering in the rain. Edward approached slowly, his heart racing. He half expected nothing to happen, to find it silent and ordinary, proving his imagination had run wild the night before. But as soon as he touched the door, the phone inside began to ring. He stepped in quickly, shutting the glass door behind him, sealing himself from the world outside. The ringing cut off the moment he lifted the receiver. "Margaret," he whispered. A pause, then the voice. Fragile, frightened, but unmistakably hers. "You came back." Edward closed his eyes, relief washing over him. "I told you I would." For a long moment, they simply listened to each other breathe, the static between them like a veil. Then Edward spoke. "Margaret, I found an article about you. You disappeared in 1987. Do you remember that night?" Her reply was broken, as though dredging up memories through fog. "Yes, I left work. It was raining. I stopped at the phone to call my parents. Then everything went strange. The glass misted over. I couldn't open the door. People walked past, But they didn't see me. They looked straight through me. Edward shivered. And since then, I've been here. Sometimes I hear voices outside faint, but they never answer when I call. Until you. The weight of her words pressed heavily on him. He looked out at the busy street. Cars splashed through puddles. People hurried under umbrellas. But no one paid attention to the lonely man speaking to an empty booth. "Margaret," he said carefully, "it's 2019 for me. 32 years have passed. I don't know how this phone works, but somehow it's bridging time." She let out a shaky laugh, more like a sob. 32 years? My God, my parents, they must have thought I was dead. Edward hesitated, not knowing how much truth to give her. He remembered the article. It had called her disappearance unsolved. Likely, her family had grieved long ago. "I think they never stopped looking," he said gently. Silence followed, heavy with the weight of all that had been lost. Then Margaret whispered, "Can you help me? Can you get me out?" Edward's throat tightened. He wanted to promise her yes, to tell her he would find a way. But what could he do? He wasn't even sure if she existed in the same reality as him, or if he was speaking to an echo trapped in time. "I'll try," he said at last. "I don't know how yet, but I'll try." Her voice broke again. "Thank you." The line crackled, and for a moment, Edward thought it might go dead. He gripped the receiver tighter, unwilling to let her slip away. "Margaret," he asked quickly, "what do you see now? Around you?" She breathed heavily, as though looking. "It's dark. The glass is clouded. But wait, I can see something. Shapes, lights. It's blurry, like looking through water." Edward glanced at the booth glass around him. Rain streaked down in rivulets, distorting the view outside. His pulse quickened. "Margaret," he whispered, "I think you're seeing what I'm seeing. The rain, the lights, it's the same." Her breath caught. "Does that mean we're in the same place?" Edward pressed his palm against the cold glass, staring at the blurred street beyond. "Maybe, just not the same time." The static grew louder, drowning her voice. Edward strained to hear, pressing the receiver harder against his ear. "Margaret, can you hear me?" Her words broke apart, fading like smoke. "Please don't leave." And then the line went dead. Edward slammed the receiver back onto its cradle, his chest heaving. The booth fell silent, its flickering light casting long shadows across the pavement. He stood there for a long time, gripping the glass, listening to the rain. When he finally stepped out, the street felt emptier than ever. He knew one thing for certain. Margaret Holloway had not vanished into nothing. She was still there, caught between then and now, calling out through the forgotten wires of the city. And Edward, whether he liked it or not, was the only one listening. Edward left Bishopsgate that night with his collar turned up against the rain. But no amount of damp or cold could chase away the unease that clung to him. Every step back toward his flat felt heavier, his shoes splashing through puddles without sound in his ears. All he could hear was Margaret's voice. Not just the words, but the way she had spoken them. Every syllable painted with loneliness and fear. By the time he reached Hackney, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. His small flat felt colder than usual, despite the radiator groaning to life. He tossed his wet coat over a chair and sat down at his desk. On the wall above, pinned by a tack, hung the printout of the old article. Margaret Holloway, missing 1987. Her name looked stark in the headline, as though staring back at him, demanding answers. Edward opened his laptop, the glow lighting his tired face. He dug deeper. Police reports, scanned newspapers, even online forums where amateur historians discussed old London mysteries. Margaret's name came up again, and again in the months following her disappearance. Colleagues described her as punctual, kind, a quiet woman who loved writing letters to her parents. Friends said she had no enemies, yet after that one rainy night, she was simply gone. No body, no evidence, just the empty street and the phone booth where she had last been seen. As the hours stretched toward dawn, Edward scribbled notes in his battered notebook. Names, dates, fragments of testimony. It read like the outline of a cold case, one that had never been solved. But unlike the police back then, Edward had something else. Her voice. By the following evening, he knew he had to go back. His day at the newspaper passed in a blur. He sat through editorial meetings, nodded at conversations, even jotted half-hearted headlines, but none of it mattered. Every clock ticked him closer to nightfall, to the booth at Bishopsgate. He arrived just after 10. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and gleaming under the lamps. The booth stood waiting at the corner, silent and unremarkable to everyone else, yet thrumming with an unseen weight for him. He stepped inside, heart pounding. The air smelled faintly of wet metal. For a long moment, nothing happened. The booth was just glass and silence. Edward's hands grew clammy on the receiver. Maybe it had all been a fevered dream. Maybe Margaret was nothing more than a lonely echo of his imagination. And then, softly, the phone rang. He snatched the receiver. Margaret! Her breath crackled through, faint but unmistakable. You came back. Edward exhaled hard, his shoulders loosening. I promised I would. I've been reading about you, Margaret. I found your name in the papers. People were looking for you. They didn't know what happened. Silence filled the line, broken only by static. When she spoke again, her voice trembled. They must have thought I was dead. They never found you, Edward said carefully. But you're not dead, are you? I don't know what I am. Her voice caught, small and uncertain. I can't move from here. I can't open the door. I'm not even sure how much time has passed. Sometimes it feels like a day. Sometimes it feels like years. Edward pressed his forehead against the cold glass, staring out at the blurred lights of the city. Listen to me. I don't know how this works, but the phone is connecting us. I'm in 2019. You're in 1987. That means you're still out there somewhere, still waiting. Maybe there's a way to bring you back. Her voice was barely a whisper. Do you really believe that? I have to, Edward said. If I don't, then all of this means nothing. For a while, neither spoke. Outside, a bus roared past, spraying water onto the pavement. Inside, Edward gripped the receiver like a lifeline. Finally, he asked, "Do you remember anything else about that night? Anything unusual?" Margaret's breathing quickened, as though reaching back through fog. I remember footsteps. A man, I think. He walked past the booth. But when I tried to call out, he didn't see me. It was like I wasn't there at all. The glass misted, and then it was as though the street had changed. The lights looked different. The cars sounded wrong. And then silence. Edward scribbled in his notebook as she spoke, his pen scratching furiously. A thought pressed at the edges of his mind. Had she slipped somehow into a gap between times, trapped where the world could no longer see her? He asked gently. Margaret, what can you see now? Her reply came after a pause. Shapes, shadows moving, but it's blurred, like water on glass. Sometimes I hear voices, but they're muffled far away. And then there's the ringing, the only thing that breaks through. Edward's pulse quickened. He pressed his palm against the booth glass, feeling its chill. Margaret, I think what you're seeing might be me. Right now. The rain, the lights. It matches. We're looking at the same street, but through different times. She gasped, her voice breaking. Does that mean you can reach me? I don't know yet, Edward admitted. But if this phone connects us, maybe there's a way to pull you back. The static surged louder, swallowing her reply. Edward pressed harder against the receiver, straining to catch her words. He thought he heard her say his name, though he had never told her it. The line cut sharply, leaving only silence. Edward lowered the handset slowly, his breath fogging the glass. Outside, life carried on, indifferent to the man clutching a notebook and chasing a ghost. But Edward knew now. Margaret Holloway was real. She was trapped in a fracture of time, and he was the only one who could hear her. The next morning, he called in sick to the office. He spent the day at the British Library, scouring through records of the city's infrastructure, telephone lines, construction projects, even council maps from the 80s. He learned that the Bishopsgate booth had been installed in 1986, just a year before Margaret vanished. It had been scheduled for removal in the early 2000s, but delays and budget cuts left it standing long past its time. He ran his hand across the microfilm reader as he pieced it together. The booth was a survivor, a forgotten relic that had somehow become a bridge between eras. But why Margaret? Why her voice alone? That night, he returned again. The air was colder, the street quieter. The booth waited, its flickering bulb casting pale light onto the slick pavement. Edward stepped inside, hard hammering, and lifted the receiver before it could even ring. At first, only static answered. Then faintly a whisper. Edward! He froze. She had said his name again. How do you know who I am? He asked quickly. Her voice cracked. Because I see you, sometimes through the glass. A shadow blurred. But I know it's you. You're the only one who listens. Edward's throat tightened. He pressed his hand against the glass, imagining her doing the same on the other side, decades apart. I'm not going to stop, he whispered. I'll find a way to bring you back, Margaret. I don't care how long it takes. Her voice trembled with hope. Please don't leave me. The static roared, the line shook, and for a moment Edward thought he felt something beneath his palm. Another hand, cold and fragile, pressing back. Then the connection snapped. Edward staggered out into the night, his breath visible in the cold air. The city stretched around him, vast and indifferent. Yet inside that forgotten booth, between wires and glass, a woman from 1987 was still waiting. And Edward Clark knew he would not rest until he uncovered the truth. The night seemed to stretch endlessly as Edward remained under the dim glow of the streetlight, his eyes fixed on the payphone. It had been almost an hour since the last call, yet the memory of that trembling voice still rang in his ears. The traffic on the avenue had thinned, leaving only the occasional taxi sweeping past, its headlights cutting brief streaks of gold against the wet asphalt. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a saxophone drifted faintly from a bar on 10th Avenue, mingling with the hum of the city that never truly slept. Edward leaned against the cold brick wall of the corner shop that had long been shuttered. The air smelled faintly of oil, and the lingering metallic scent of rain. He felt as though the city itself was holding its breath, watching him, waiting for him to decide whether to walk away or to remain with the forgotten relic of communication that refused to be silent. At precisely 12:37 a.m., the payphone rang again. The shrill, unexpected sound startled him so much that he almost dropped his notebook. His heart leapt into his throat as he reached for the receiver, his hands trembling. "Hello," he whispered, his voice hoarse. This time, there was no pause. A man's voice spoke directly, low and hurried, with the distinct rhythm of someone trying not to be overheard. "You shouldn't have answered," the voice said. "It's not safe for you." Edward froze. "Who is this?" he asked, trying to keep his tone steady. The line crackled with static. Then, almost in a whisper, the voice added, "They're watching. Not just you. The others. Don't stay near the phone." And then the call ended abruptly, leaving Edward with nothing but the hollow sound of the dial tone. He stood there, shivering despite the humid night air, feeling as though the shadows around him had grown heavier, pressing in closer. He turned instinctively, scanning the darkened storefronts, the empty sidewalks, and the occasional flicker of light from distant windows. Everything appeared normal, yet the voice had planted a seed of doubt deep within him. A thought began to gnaw at him. What if this payphone wasn't just some relic left to rust? What if it was still being used, secretly, quietly, by people who had no other way to communicate? He scribbled notes quickly in his journal, marking the times, the words, the atmosphere. He had been a freelance journalist for years, chasing stories hidden in the cracks of the city. But this one felt different. It felt personal. By 1:10 a.m., Edward had convinced himself to walk away. His legs ached from standing so long, and his nerves felt stretched thin. Yet as he stepped back toward 49th Street, the phone rang again. This time, it didn't stop. It rang and rang, each chime echoing across the silent intersection like a call that demanded to be answered. Against every instinct telling him to leave, Edward picked it up once more. "You're still there," the voice muttered, sounding more resigned than surprised. "You're curious. That's dangerous." "Please, I just want to understand," Edward pressed, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Why this phone? Who are you?" There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of faint breathing on the other end. And then, with a quiet intensity, the man said, "This phone is not forgotten. It's the only one left that they don't control. But now, because you've stayed too long, they know your face." The line went dead again. Edward lowered the receiver slowly, his pulse racing. He felt exposed, as though every window above him hid eyes that were watching, studying. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He backed away from the phone, yet found it impossible to leave. Something anchored him to the spot. An unshakable sense that he had stumbled into a story too important to ignore. The night deepened. A light drizzle began to fall, peppering the pavement with tiny splashes that shimmered under the glow of the street lamp. Edward pulled his jacket tighter around himself, wondering if he should try calling someone he trusted. But his phone battery had long since drained. He was alone with the payphone and the mystery it carried. At 2:02 a.m., the payphone rang again. But this time, Edward didn't rush to answer. He let it ring, counting each chime. 1, 2, 3, for 12 times before it stopped. A minute later, it rang once more, only 5 times before going silent. Edward's chest tightened as he realized It wasn't just random calls anymore. It was a code. He quickly jotted down the sequences in his notebook, circling the numbers with shaking hands. 12, 5, what could it mean? A date? A location? Coordinates? The possibilities spiraled in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. And then, as though the night wanted to confirm his fears, a figure appeared at the far end of the street. A man in a long coat, walking with measured steps, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat. He wasn't rushing, but he wasn't wandering either. His stride had purpose, direction, straight toward the corner where Edward stood. Edward's breath caught. He glanced at the payphone, then back at the approaching stranger. The city suddenly felt too quiet, too empty, as if the world had narrowed down to this one street corner, this one moment. He had to choose: stay and face whatever this was, or slip away into the shadows before the man arrived. Edward's legs stiffened, almost refusing to move, as the figure drew nearer. The man's pace was steady, deliberate, as though he knew exactly where he was going, and it was straight toward the payphone. A thin fog began to roll in from the Hudson, softening the edges of the city's sharp lines. The streetlight above flickered once, then held steady, bathing both men in a weak halo of yellow light. Edward's throat went dry. He thought of ducking into the alley behind the corner shop, but something in him urged him to stay. The payphone had already pulled him into its gravity. Running now felt impossible. The stranger finally stopped just a few feet away. He didn't look directly at Edward, but rather at the phone itself, his gloved hand brushing across the scratched metal casing as though reacquainting himself with an old friend. His presence carried a chill that had nothing to do with the drizzle now soaking Edward's collar. "People don't linger here anymore," the man said quietly, his voice gravelly, tinged with an accent Edward couldn't quite place. "Except those who shouldn't." Edward swallowed hard. I just heard it ring. I thought someone might need help." The man finally lifted his gaze. His eyes, shadowed under the brim of his hat, studied Edward in silence for what felt like an eternity. "Help?" he echoed, almost mocking the word. "This phone doesn't bring help. It brings questions. Questions that can't be unasked." Edward tightened his grip on his notebook, the pages damp from the mist. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. The stranger's lips curved into the faintest smile. "The wrong question," he murmured. Then, leaning slightly closer, he added, "The better one is, why are you here?" Before Edward could answer, the phone rang again, loud, piercing, the sound shattering the fragile stillness between them. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped back, as if offering Edward the choice. "Go on," he said softly. "Answer it. See what you've already tangled yourself in." Edward hesitated, his hand hovering over the receiver. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, matching the rhythm of the ringing. Finally, almost against his will, he picked it up. "Hello?" There was only breathing on the other end, heavy, uneven, like someone struggling to remain calm. Then a woman's voice, faint and trembling, came through. "They know your name now, Edward." His blood ran cold. He nearly dropped the receiver. "Who are you? How do you know who I am?" The woman's voice cracked, as if she were crying. "Please, leave before it's too late. They'll use you, just like they used the rest of us." And then silence. Edward pressed the receiver closer, desperate for more, but the line had gone dead. Slowly, he placed it back on the cradle, his hand shaking. He turned to the stranger, but the man in the coat was already walking away. vanishing into the fog without another word. Edward stood alone again, his mind racing, the weight of the message pressing heavily on him. Someone had spoken his name. Someone he had never met. He felt the edges of paranoia creeping in. Every shadow now a threat. Every passing car a potential watcher. Still, he couldn't walk away. He scribbled notes furiously, recording every word, every detail of the encounter. This was no longer just a curiosity. It was something far larger, and he was caught in its center. By 3 a.m., Edward noticed something strange. Across the street, a black sedan had parked beneath a burnt-out street lamp. Its windows were tinted, its engine silent. But Edward could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him. He pretended not to notice, keeping his focus on the phone, though his chest tightened with unease. The payphone rang again at 3:12. Short bursts this time. 3 rings, a pause, then 4 more. Edward scribbled the sequence in his notebook. 3 to 4. Another code, perhaps, but its meaning eluded him. Summoning what courage he had left, he lifted the receiver. "I know you can hear me," he said firmly. "You keep calling, leaving pieces of something I don't understand. If you want me to listen, then stop with the riddles. Tell me the truth." For a moment, there was only static. Then a male voice spoke, not the same one as before. This one was calm, precise, almost emotionless. "You've already chosen the truth, Edward. That's why you're still standing there. But truth has a cost. Are you prepared to pay it?" Edward's fingers tightened on the receiver. "What cost?" The voice gave a low, humorless chuckle. "Sleep, safety, trust. The cost is everything you think you know about this city, about yourself." Edward felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Because you answered," the voice replied. And then the line went dead once more. Edward leaned against the booth, feeling the rain seep into his hair, his jacket, his bones. He thought of leaving, of returning to the safety of his small apartment on the Upper West Side, of crawling under his thin blanket and convincing himself this was all just the rambling of lonely souls using a forgotten machine. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Too many coincidences. Too many voices that knew too much. And now, his name. At 3:45, as the rain fell harder, Edward made a decision. He would return during the day, when the city was alive, when the street corner was just another anonymous place lost among the thousands of others. Maybe in daylight, the mystery would unravel, or maybe it would vanish altogether, like a dream. Yet even as he thought this, the payphone rang again. This time, just once, a single chime, sharp and final, echoing in the damp night air. It didn't ring again. Edward didn't answer. Not this time. He stood there until the rain soaked him completely, until the black sedan drove off silently, disappearing down 9th Avenue, until the first hints of dawn began to brighten the eastern sky. Only then did he turn and walk home, the weight of the night heavy in his notebook, in his chest, in his every step. But even as he left the corner behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that the phone wasn't done with him. It never was. Edward barely slept that night. When he finally did drift into shallow dreams, they were filled with the shrill ringing of the payphone and the hollow voices that echoed endlessly through the line. He awoke just after 7, the light of early morning spilling pale and reluctant through the blinds of his small apartment. The city outside was already stirring. The sounds of delivery trucks, the distant horns, and the murmur of commuters blended into the familiar New York symphony. Yet to Edward, it all felt strangely muted, as though the world had been dulled by what he had witnessed hours earlier. He sat at his kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, staring at his notebook. Pages were filled with rushed handwriting, numbers circled, times underlined, phrases like, "They know your face," and "not safe" scrawled with uneven strokes. He traced his finger over the notes, wondering if he had simply become too consumed by loneliness and his own need for stories. But no, he couldn't dismiss the weight of the voices. The woman had known his name. By mid-morning, Edward convinced himself to return. He told himself it was for clarity, for closure. But deep down, he knew it was compulsion. Something about that phone had taken root in him, and ignoring it now felt impossible. Around 9:15 a.m., he stepped out onto the bustling street corner of 49th and 9th. The world looked different in daylight. The drizzle had washed the sidewalks clean, and now the sun gleamed faintly against puddles that reflected the high-rise buildings. Food carts were already setting up nearby, filling the air with the smell of pretzels and coffee. Commuters hurried past, their faces buried in phones or lost in thoughts, paying no attention to the old payphone that stood stubbornly against the corner wall. Edward approached slowly, as though it might react to his presence. In the daylight, it looked harmless, almost laughable. An outdated machine covered in faded stickers, graffiti scrawled across its metal sides, the receiver worn and frayed at the cord. He touched the cold surface, half expecting it to hum with life. Nothing, just silence. Still he lingered. He bought a coffee from the vendor nearby and stood sipping it, pretending to read the newspaper, but his eyes never strayed far from the booth. Minutes stretched into half an hour. The city moved briskly around him, yet the payphone remained still, stubbornly quiet. At 9:47 a.m., it rang. Edward nearly dropped his cup. Heads turned briefly, curious at the sudden sound, but just as quickly people dismissed it, resuming their rush. To them, it was just a relic making noise. To Edward, it was a summons. He grabbed the receiver, pressing it tightly to his ear. "You came back," said the woman's voice, softer now, calmer in the morning light. Edward's pulse quickened. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" The woman didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "They'll follow the signal. You don't have long. Write this down. 47. Essex. Tonight. 10. Edward's pen scratched furiously against the page of his notebook. 47 Essex. Tonight at 10. Who's going to be there? You want answers. You'll find them. But if you value your life, come alone." And then the line went dead once more. Edward lowered the receiver slowly, his stomach twisting. He turned, half expecting the stranger in the long coat to reappear, or the black sedan to be idling nearby. But there was nothing. Just a mother pulling her child along, a group of construction workers laughing loudly, a cyclist weaving impatiently through traffic. The ordinary world carried on, blissfully unaware of the cryptic message he had just received. He spent the afternoon in restless anticipation. Essex Street was far downtown, a neighborhood alive with narrow streets, hidden cafes, and old tenements that seemed to breathe history. Edward knew the area well, but never before had he associated it with danger. Now, each thought of it carried the same knot in his chest that he had felt by the payphone. At 7 p.m., as dusk began to descend over Manhattan, Edward packed his notebook and a small recorder into his bag. He walked for nearly an hour, weaving through the busy streets, past Washington Square, down into the Lower East Side where Essex Street waited like a stage already set. The night was warm, but the air carried the kind of charged stillness that often preceded storms. He reached number 47 just after 9:30. It was a building that looked forgotten by time. Brickwork chipped, windows boarded on the upper floors, a metal gate rusted across the entrance. The street itself was quieter than he expected. Only the occasional passerby, shadows stretching long under flickering street lamps. He leaned against the wall across the street, notebook ready, heart pounding. At exactly 10 o'clock, a figure emerged from the shadows. A woman, perhaps in her late 30s, her coat pulled tightly around her, her eyes darting nervously as she approached the building. Edward recognized her voice instantly. It was the same trembling tone he had heard on the line. She stopped in front of the gate, glancing both ways before speaking softly, as though reciting something rehearsed. "The lines are breaking. The last one must be kept alive." From the darkness beyond the gate, another voice answered. Male, stern measured. "And the outsider?" The woman hesitated, then whispered, "He already knows too much." Edward's breath caught. He shrank back against the wall, but it was too late. The woman's eyes flicked up, landing squarely on him. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the street. Then, with an urgency that froze his blood, she shook her head. "Run," she mouthed. Behind her, footsteps echoed from the building. More figures were approaching, their shapes indistinct in the gloom. Edward's legs jolted into motion, his notebook clutched tight as he fled down Essex, weaving through the narrow streets as if the whole city had turned against him. He didn't dare look back, not until the noise of pursuit had faded and the comforting buzz of traffic returned. When he finally stopped, breathless and sweating beneath the neon glow of a late-night diner, he collapsed into a booth and tried to steady his hands enough to write. His notes were frantic, fragmented. 47 Essex, the woman, the phrase about the lines, the warning to run. Nothing tied together, yet everything screamed of a secret too large to ignore. He ordered coffee, barely touching it, his eyes flicking constantly toward the window, half expecting the sedan to pull up, or the man in the coat to step through the door. But the night wore on, and no one came. Still, Edward knew one thing with certainty. The story was no longer just about a forgotten payphone. It was about something hidden deep within the city, something alive, watching, listening, pulling him further into its orbit with every ring. And the phone, silent now, would ring again. The night after the Essex Street encounter lingered in Edward's mind like a fever dream. Even when he reached the safety of his apartment, bolting the door behind him, the echo of the woman's eyes and the whispered word "run" refused to let him rest. He sat in darkness until the city outside had quieted into its late-night hum, then lay in bed wide awake, every creak in the hallway stirring new suspicions. Sleep never truly came. By morning, the city was awake again, oblivious. Edward found himself moving through the motions of normality, buying coffee from the corner shop, nodding at the doorman of his building. Yet everything felt staged, artificial, as if the world had become a set, and he the only one aware of the script running beneath. He opened his notebook and studied the fragments from Essex Street. The lines are breaking. The last one must be kept alive. The outsider already knows too much. And then there was the address, the time, the silent warning to flee. He replayed it over and over, convinced it was not random. Whoever those people were, they used the payphone to communicate because it was untraceable. He wondered how long such a system had been in place, hidden in plain sight, while the rest of the city moved forward with smartphones and encrypted apps. A forgotten relic, yet perhaps the most vital piece of their chain. By noon, Edward could no longer stay idle. He left his apartment with his recorder and notebook, determined to walk Essex Street again. The Lower East Side was busier in daylight, filled with market stalls, delivery trucks, and children running past with backpacks. Yet number 47 stood unchanged, silent, hollow, its gates still locked, its windows blank. No one seemed to notice it. Edward lingered nearby, pretending to study the market stalls. He watched carefully, but no one approached the building. Eventually, he tried speaking with a man selling fruit across the street, an older vendor with tired eyes. "That place," Edward said casually, pointing to number 47, "always looks abandoned. What's the story?" The vendor frowned, lowering his voice. "Been empty for years. At least that's what they say. But sometimes, late at night, I see shadows. Lights where there shouldn't be any. People going in through the side alley." Edward's pulse quickened. "What kind of people?" The vendor shook his head, suddenly nervous. "Don't ask. Best to keep walking." That answer only fed the storm inside Edward. He bought an apple he didn't want, thanked the man, and walked away. But his eyes kept flicking back toward the building. That afternoon, he went to the library, combing through old records of Essex Street, building permits, property ownership, fire inspections. Everything pointed to the structure being officially abandoned since the late 1990s. But gaps appeared in the timeline, stretches of years with no documentation, as though someone had carefully erased them. At 4 p.m., he sat by a library window, watching rain streak the glass, when his phone vibrated. No number was displayed, just unknown. His chest tightened. He answered cautiously. "You shouldn't have gone back," said a man's voice, calm and cold. Edward gripped the phone. "Who is this?" The voice ignored his question. "Do you think you're the first? Others have chased the sound of that phone. None of them lasted. Leave while you still can." Edward's breath caught. "What happened to them?" Silence. Then, quietly, they stopped answering. The call ended. He sat frozen in the library, the words pounding in his mind. He imagined faceless figures vanishing into the sprawl of New York, swallowed by the very mystery he now chased. He scribbled the phrase "stopped answering" in his notebook, circling it 3 times. That evening, Edward returned once more to the corner of 49th and 9th, as though drawn by an invisible thread. The payphone stood waiting, silent, its presence both ordinary and immense. He stood across from it, watching the commuters pass by, none giving it a second glance. At 8:15 it rang. Edward's chest tightened, but he lifted the receiver anyway. "You went to Essex," the woman's voice whispered. "I told you not to. They know." Edward's hand trembled. "Who are they? Tell me." Her breath hitched. "They keep the lines alive. They keep the city breathing. If one breaks, everything changes. Don't you understand? The payphones aren't dead. They're veins. The last connection. And now, you're part of it." The line crackled violently, and then the call cut out. Edward remained frozen, the receiver pressed against his ear, the weight of her words crashing over him. Veins, connection, a network hiding in plain sight. He placed the receiver back, his thoughts spiraling. For the next week, Edward fell into a strange rhythm. He visited the corner at different hours. Early morning, late afternoon, just before midnight. Sometimes the phone rang. Sometimes it didn't. Each time he answered, a new fragment came, a new piece of the puzzle that never seemed to fit neatly. The signals are thinning. Watch for the black car. The outsider will choose. Each phrase left him more entangled, more certain that he had stumbled into something vast and unseen. He filled page after page of his notebook, his handwriting growing frantic, his apartment walls slowly plastered with notes, strings connecting times, numbers, and places. Yet the more he uncovered, the more the paranoia grew. He noticed the same faces passing his street at odd hours. A man in a cap lingering too long by the subway entrance. The black sedan reappearing near his block. Engine idling without driver visible. By the 10th day, Edward barely recognized himself in the mirror. His eyes were sunken, his hair disheveled, his skin pale from sleepless nights. But the obsession burned brighter than his exhaustion. At 2 a.m. on a Thursday, the payphone rang again. Edward answered, his voice hoarse. "It's too late," the man's voice said. "You've heard too much. The only way out now is in." Edward whispered, "In where?" The line hissed, then clicked off. He stood there, rain dripping from the awning above, the empty city stretching in every direction. He felt as though he was no longer simply chasing a story. The story was chasing him, and the phone, still warm from his hand, seemed to wait for the next move. The night air of New York was cooler now, brushing softly against the faces of passers-by who hurried along the corner of Broome Street and Lafayette. The forgotten payphone still stood there, silent yet strangely alive, as if it had absorbed all the secrets whispered into its receiver over the years. Arthur, tired from the evening's encounters, looked back once more. He noticed a young boy tugging at his mother's sleeve, pointing curiously at the payphone. The mother smiled faintly but kept walking, as though she too had once known what it meant, though she didn't dare explain. For Arthur, this small relic of the past was no longer just an object. It was a witness, a companion, a reminder that stories never really vanish. They simply wait for someone to listen again. He felt both heavy and light as he stepped away. Heavy with the weight of all the voices that had passed through that metal frame, and light because he knew he had found something rare, a hidden thread connecting strangers across time. The city never sleeps, they always say, and on that night New York proved it once again. Lights shimmered against the tall windows, sirens cried faintly in the distance, and a forgotten payphone on a street corner held within it a pulse of memory that would not die. Perhaps one day, another passerby would stop, lift the receiver, and hear what Arthur had heard. Perhaps not, but the possibility alone was enough to give the payphone meaning. And so, as the city moved forward into yet another restless night, the forgotten payphone remained, a quiet guardian of stories untold, waiting for its next listener.